Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to, I guess, was this week 6 for PPA 500. We are very quickly speeding to the end of our time together. In fact, we only have 2 weeks left officially in the class, so we are almost there. So since we only have 2 weeks left, I thought this would probably be a really good time to kind of reset where we're at and then where we're going over the next 2 weeks. So I did review all the midterm assessments and I returned those to you with some feedback, some comments. What I usually do is I will use the annotation feature, and so I will give points for each scenario. So I did that, and then I also in the feedback box gave you a little bit of feedback as well. I thought everyone did very well on the midterm assessment. It looked like all the grades were in the A and the B range, really A in the very upper B range. And so the grades are very high. So I think you should be commended for doing a great job of taking the information and applying it in a relevant way to those scenarios I provided for you. So thank you for that. And those are done. Coming up next week, you only really have one assignment, and it's a pretty easy one. It's your fourth beach board essay. And that fourth beach board essay deals with the same topic you dealt with on the midterm assessment in terms of public administration as a discipline. So what you can do is just take your answer from the midterm assessment and then put that in discussion boards so you can share with your colleagues. So you can, if you want to copy and paste your answer in the discussion board, you can certainly do that. If you would like to make some modifications or changes to your answer for the midterm, you can do that as well. But you'll be addressing this question again about public administration as a discipline. And the reason why I repeat that assignment for Beach Board essay number 4 is because, first off, it's very important that you're in an MPA program. So it's really vital for you to think about this idea of the study of public administration and what elements of the study of public administration would recommend that's a discipline, what elements would recommend against it being a discipline, just like you did on the midterm assessment. So it's an important enough topic that I think it's good that we really have a strong focus on it. And secondly, I'm doing this because I want you to be able to share your answer with your colleagues and then be able to read your colleagues' answers and hopefully get a kind of a dialogue going in discussion board about the discipline of public administration. Now, in reading your answers from your midterm assessment, I know that there is a good bit of agreement about public administration as a discipline, but I still think it's something important enough that we can do in discussion boards so you can have that open dialogue with each other about the discipline of public administration. So that's your next beach board assignment, and that one's due next week. And I know you just turned in and got your midterm assessment graded, but since we are a hybrid course and we're accelerated, the final assessment is right around the corner. So I've made the final assessment available on our beach board site, so you can go and start working on that final assessment whenever you would like. You have most of the information to answer the scenarios. The other information you need to answer the scenarios you'll get in tonight's class, and then you'll get again the rest of the information in next week's class. So by the end of next week's session, you'll have all the information you need to answer those 5 scenarios. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page with the final assessment, let me go ahead and share out the assessment and we can just walk through it for a couple minutes. And I'll show you the types of things I'm asking you to do and the type of information that you'll need to apply. Now, the structure of the final assessment is just like the structure for the midterm assessment. We have 5 scenarios and 2 questions related to each scenario. So it's the same type of idea. The final assessment, you can complete it using all the information from the course. So information from our discussions, our weekly discussions, information from lectures, information from texts and articles. It's all at your disposal, just like you had all that information for the midterm as well. The final assessment then is due by midnight on October 12th, which is our last week of class together. So let's go through the final assessment and I'll show you some of the scenarios and some of the questions that you'll be answering. So in scenario number 1, we're going to really get at the heart of human resource management and federal employment. So in this very brief scenario, your friend applied for a job with the FBI 8 months ago. She is obviously frustrated with the delay in the hiring process. Bills need to be paid, so she finally decided to accept a job with a private sector company. She laments to you how she wishes she could have waited for the FBI job, but doesn't understand how the federal government hires new employees. And this is, I've had a couple of students who have gone on to get jobs with the FBI, and it has been a very protracted hiring process. It's not unusual for them to have to wait 8 to 12 months before they actually get that job in the FBI. So that's one of those organizations that they have a lot of background checks and they have a whole lot of vetting that they go through. So in question 1A, as a good student of public administration, you decide to provide her with some background information on the eras of public employment in the United States. And this is information that we probably won't get to tonight, but we will get to next Wednesday. Describe the three main eras of public federal employment and how these eras have changed over the years. Next week, we'll talk about the era of gentlemen, we'll talk about the era of spoils, and we'll talk about the era of merit and how people got jobs in the federal bureaucracy in each one of those three eras. So you'll get that information no later than next week. And then in 1B, after regaling your friend with the history of federal employment, you begin to reflect on current hiring practices. Which era is or are best represented by today's federal employment and why? So are we currently, do you think, in an era of merit, era of spoils, era of patronage, or era of merit, or a combination of two of those three eras? So you either select one era that we're in, or say we're in a combination of more than one of those eras we'll talk about next week. So that's, again, kind of your public employment type of question from the information from next week's class. Then for scenario number 2, let me try and scroll down there for you. The Department of Aging, which is a department that we used in one of the scenarios on the midterm assessment, now has a new leader. Mr. Lemon is gone, and the new governor has selected you as the head of the department. You walk into an organization that has neglected human resource management functions for years. One of your first meetings is with your human resources director to discuss how to modernize human resource functions. Positions have not been reviewed for several years, and most employees are working outside of their position descriptions. So in question 2A, what would you instruct your human resources director to do? In other words, what functions of human resource management need to be completed? And we will cover this in class next week when we talk about managing human resources. Then in 2B, another major issue faced by the organization is its relationships with its bargaining units. The current contract has expired, and the union and department are now at an impasse. Discuss the strategies that could be used to resolve this impasse. And next week, when we talk about HR, we will talk about things such as mediation, fact-finding, arbitration. So you'll have that information next week to be able to answer that scenario. So that's kind of your human resource management scenario. Then scenario number 3, the city of Preble Heights, another throwback to our midterm, is struggling with its budget. It uses a simple line item budget and typically increases expenditures each year in connection with increases in gross domestic product rates. Over the past 5 years, the city failed to complete its budget on time and struggled to balance revenues and expenditures. The city auditor found that many programs are inefficient and are not achieving their goals and objectives. Standard & Poor's and Moody's, which are both credit rating agencies we'll talk about next week, both reduced the city's credit rating due to its budget issues. As a city council member, you and your colleagues need to recommend a new budgeting format to try and alleviate these concerns. In question 3A, select and recommend a new budget format for the city that will address the concerns in the scenario. And then in 3B, the city's aquatic center needs renovation. Given the city's fiscal problems, it is clear that the city lacks the resources to complete the project without borrowing money. The Aquatic Center is open to citizens for lap swimming Monday through Saturday from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Citizens pay a $3 fee to use the facility, and 100 residents use the facility for lap swimming 200 days out of the year. The city also charges a $20,000 per year fee to the school district and club teams to use the facility for practices. A total of 6 teams pay this fee. The operating expenses for the Aquatic Center amount to $180,000 per year. Since the city does not have the money to pay for renovations, it proposes a bond to cover the cost. Which type of bond would you recommend and why? Now, you don't have the information yet to answer those questions, but those questions you will have the information to answer after next week's class. Because next week we will not only look at managing human resources, but we will also look at managing fiscal resources as well. We'll talk about different types of budget formats, and we'll also talk about different types of ways in which cities borrow money to fund their capital projects. So that's all the information that you'll get from next week. Oops. Then in scenario number 4, the city of Preble Heights also has a unit known as the Economic Revitalization Department, otherwise known as the ERD. ERD's primary task is to implement a policy known as the Urban Revitalization Initiative. The initiative provides cash grants to businesses who renovate their facilities and remain in urban areas as opposed to moving to other states. The primary beneficiaries of these grants are obviously business owners who are willing to stay where they are and continue to contribute to economic growth in urban areas of the city, primarily downtown. To be successful, the policy would need to provide enough grant money to offset the cost savings of potentially moving to other states and areas. Not all members of the ERD are in favor of the policy goals and believe that it is not the role of government to influence business decisions. These employees have sometimes been accused of slow walking or slowing down grant applications to delay the payment of money to applicants. 4A, from a policy implementation perspective, utilize Pressman and Waldowski's implementation research to illustrate some of the barriers to successfully implementing this policy. That's information that you will get from our discussion tonight of policy analysis. And then 4B, drawing upon the 4 models of organizational effectiveness. Examine this scenario from the perspective of each of these models. How would each model define the agency's effectiveness in implementing this policy? That is also information that you will get from tonight's session as well. So after tonight's session, you'll have everything that you need to address scenario number 4. Then last but not least, scenario 5. It has now been 2 years since Preble Heights renovated its recreation center. The Parks and Recreation Commissioner, Julielle Lopez, approached the council last year with a proposal to address juvenile delinquency. The city has seen a rise in the incidence of graffiti and vandalism over the past several years. Ms. Lopez proposed creating a program of after-school sports offered free of charge at the recreation center. The after-school sports program is offered from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday and 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Saturdays. The goal of the program is to give youth something to do after school and deter them from engaging in acts of graffiti and vandalism. The program has been up and running for 1 year. You are a program specialist, and the city manager has approached you to create a program evaluation to evaluate the effectiveness of the after-school sports program. So in question 5A, identify and discuss the primary independent, dependent, and control variables that you would use in your program evaluation. And let me scoot this down a little bit, if I can. Hold on one second. Okay. And 5B, identify and discuss the research design that you would recommend using to evaluate the effectiveness of this program. This is your program evaluation question that we will cover the information tonight. So by the end of class tonight, you'll also then be able to answer scenario 5. So scenario 4 and scenario 5, you'll be ready to answer after tonight's class. The same rules apply to the final assessment as applied to the midterm assessment, in that the answer should be concise and parsimonious. Typically, we're looking at maybe 1 to 2 paragraphs to answer each one of the questions. So take the exact same approach that you took to the midterm assessment and apply that then to answering the questions on this final assessment. So it's available for you on the Beachboard site. You have a couple of weeks to be working on it. So I just wanted to introduce you to this tonight so that you can have some time to look at it and start formulating some of your answers. But again, it's a very similar approach to what we used on the midterm assessments. Any basic questions, preliminary questions about the final assessments? Okay. Yes, Rebecca, go ahead.
I'm looking at the site and I'm not seeing it in the content section. I'm wondering if you can direct us where it's located.
Let me take a quick look. I wonder if I just did not click the availability. So let me check real quick. Go to content and make sure it's available. Sometimes it's a little availability button that sometimes you toggle on, and even though you toggle it on, it's still, yep, it didn't take. So hold on, let me just change that real quick. Okay, it should be available now. So you may have to refresh, you may have to go back in, but it is now available. So thanks for pointing that out, but it should be available and should be visible. And it is, like you said, it is in the content section. It's in the content section. Let's see, where is it at in content? It is, let's see, where do I have it at in there? I have it right underneath the midterm assessment. So you should have a tab that shows up for that, and it should be there now. Let me go ahead and get some things moved. Okay, Rebecca, you see it now? Okay, great, thank you. But thanks for pointing that out. Again, yeah, sometimes I toggle it on, it doesn't go on. I have to do it a couple of different times. So, okay, let me go ahead and stop that share. And let me go ahead and share out our slides for this evening. And where we are currently in the class is we've already talked about a lot of the theoretical approaches that are used in the discipline of public administration. What I want to spend the rest of our time talking about for the next 2 weeks is to talk about some of the functions of public administration and some of the things that we do as public administrators. And so when we talk about the functions of public administration, some of the things that we do as public administrators, we're going to really break it down into 4 major categories. As public administrators, we are very much involved in the policy process. As we know from our discussion of the differences between public and private sectors, that one of the things that really distinguishes the public from the private sector is that public administrators get involved in not just policy implementation and execution, but policy formulation as well. That we're also very much involved in putting those policies together and helping elected officials design those policies. So as public administrators, one of our major functions is to participate in the entire policy process. Policy formulation, policy implementation and execution, and finally, policy evaluation. So we're going to start off tonight talking about those different phases of the policy process, how those different phases of the policy process work, and our role as public administrators in those different phases of the public policy process. So in essence, our discussion to start off tonight will be a foreshadowing of the PPA 670 policy analysis course, which I'm assuming since you're in your first semester of the program, you haven't registered for 670 yet, but this will kind of give you a little bit of insight into the type of information you'll be covering when you get to 670. So that's one aspect of the functions of public administrators. Then after we do that, we'll take a break. And then the second half of class tonight, we will talk about a second function, which is public program evaluation. And we'll talk about the role that administrators play in evaluating public programs and the difference between a public program and a public policy and how programs are related to public policies. And our entire goal in being involved in the policy process and being involved in the public program evaluation process is to try and enhance the effectiveness of public policies and public programs. So we will wrap up our discussion tonight then talking about what we mean by effectiveness in public administration. And I'll give you 4 different models that you can use to define and then measure the effectiveness of public policies, public programs, and indeed public organizations as well. So that's kind of an overview of the agenda for tonight and the topics that we will cover. Then next week, we will shift our attention to 2 other important functions of public administration. We'll talk about managing human resources. We'll go through the development of federal employment, and then we'll talk about the functions of human resource management in the public sector. And then we'll wrap up our discussion next week by then talking about managing fiscal resources, how we manage budgets, how we manage revenues and expenditures, and talk about that type of a management function. So as we talk about policy tonight, we're going to foreshadow your 670 course. Later on tonight, when we talk about program evaluation, we will be foreshadowing your 696 research methods course. Next week, as we talk about managing human resources, we will foreshadow your PPA 577 human resource management course. And then as we talk about managing fiscal resources, we will highlight what you'll encounter in PPA 555 public budgeting. Last week, when we talked about the theoretical approaches to public administration, we were foreshadowing your PPA 660 organization theory course. So the nice thing about 500 is what we'll end up doing is we'll end up giving you a little bit of insight into all of the core courses that you'll be taking throughout your future in the program. So when you get to those core courses, a lot of these concepts and a lot of these ideas will be very much familiar to you. And it won't be any type of unusual or unforeseen type of topic or issue. You'll already be somewhat well versed in it. Then when you get in your core courses, you will just dig deeper. We're doing the tip of the iceberg here in this class. Then you'll dig deeper into those issues once you get into those subsequent core courses. So that's the plan, and that's how it all is supposed to work. So hopefully it will all work that way. Let me go ahead and open up my text chat box in case we have anyone who has any questions or want to participate. Okay, let's get started with our discussion of public policy. Public policy is related to public programs, but we really need to distinguish between a public policy and a public program. And to distinguish between those two, think about a policy as kind of an umbrella approach. So the public policy is the overarching umbrella. And then all the individual programs hold up that policy umbrella. So to give you an example, maybe we might have a policy goal of educating at-risk youth. However, we're defining at-risk youth, and here in the state of California, in a statutory way, we have a very specific statutory definition of what we consider to be at-risk youth. But our policy goal is to better educate at-risk youth. That's our policy goal. Within that policy of educating at-risk youth, we may fund several public programs that are all designed to support that overarching policy goal of educating at-risk youth. So perhaps we will have a job training program. Perhaps we will have a computer literacy program. Perhaps we will have a interviewing skills type of program. Perhaps we'll have a midnight basketball or after-school recreation type of program. Perhaps we would have a program that funds counselors to meet with and work with students. all those are the individual public programs that are all designed to hold up and achieve that policy goal of educating at-risk youth. So again, kind of look at like an umbrella with a lot of different posts. The umbrella is the policy, and then what supports that policy are those individual public programs. So there is a difference between a policy and a program. And because of those differences, there are different ways in which we as public administrators will evaluate policies as compared to evaluating public programs. So let's start with the policy, the overarching approach, and talk about the public policy making process. There are several different phases we go through in the creation of public policies. The first phase is what's known as the formulation or the formation phase. Some people say formulation, some formation, it's the same thing. So the policy formulation phase of the process. In the policy formulation phase of the process, this is where we, number one, decide what issues or problems we are going to try and solve with public policies. So we decide which issues or problems are solvable and which issues or problems are important enough for us to devote our attention and our resources toward trying to solve those problems. So first we have to have issues that come on to what we call the formal decision-making agenda. If you remember back to when we talked about the idea of power several weeks ago, and I introduced you to John Gaventa and his idea of power and powerlessness in the Appalachian Valley. And in his study, remember, he was looking at a coal mining town and asking the question of how are these coal mine owners exerting so much power over the coal miners? And he came up with these three different faces of power: overt power, mobilization of bias, and co-optation. That second face of power, mobilization of bias, is what we're talking about here. That's agenda setting. It really looks at how an issue gets onto the formal decision-making agenda of a decision-making body. So remember in the Gaventa study, all these mine safety issues were not making it to the agenda of the West Virginia state legislature. And since the state legislature never took up these issues and never discussed these issues, they obviously never passed a law or never passed any policies making coal mines safer. That's mobilization of bias, the ability to keep those issues off of the formal decision-making agenda. So our first step here in the formulation phase is for an issue to get onto the formal agenda to begin with. A very famous political scientist by the name of John Kingdon spent a lot of his career looking at policy and looking at how issues make it onto the formal agenda. For John Kingdon, he kind of looked at the world as a primordial soup of issues. He says, kind of there's this primordial soup out there of all these issues and all these problems that we as a society are aware of, but we don't really put our resources and time behind doing anything about them. They're just kind of out there in the general consciousness of society. What he was interested in is understanding how some of those issues make their way out of this primordial soup and make their way onto a formal decision-making agenda. And what he found is that there's what he called a policy stream convergence, where problems come into contact with proposals, which come into contact with the right people to make decisions, and it opens up what he calls a policy window. And when that policy window opens up, these issues make it from this primordial soup of general consciousness onto the formal decision-making agenda of a decision-making body. That's what's known as agenda setting, getting issues onto the agenda. Now, we know in the very political world of policy formulation, one way you can get an issue on the agenda is through economic influence. So if you are a lobbyist and you have a political action committee whereby you can contribute money to a member of Congress to help that member of Congress get elected or reelected, then that will be influential in helping you get your issue onto the agenda of, say, the House of Representatives. So unfortunately, a lot of that agenda setting comes due to the use of resources and the use of money in campaign contributions. That's the political aspect of the policymaking process. But we have to decide in agenda setting which issues will get onto the formal decision-making agenda of that decision-making body. We can rely upon some decision-making models that will help us understand how some issues make it onto the formal agenda and the types of policies that we will create to try and address those issues or solve those problems. And the four primary decision-making models that we usually talk about in public administration are rational comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can model of decision-making. So let's go ahead and talk about each of those four decision-making models and how they may influence how issues get onto the agenda, and then the types of resulting policy approaches that we create to address those issues and those problems. So rational comprehensive decision-making, which I'm sure you've run into before, is just like it sounds, very rational and comprehensive, in that we try and take into account all the possible information in order to make a decision. So we're making our decisions driven by a consideration of all the possible information that is out there. So in a rational comprehensive decision-making model, our first step is to clearly define our goals. What are we trying to achieve by addressing this issue or this problem? So if we're trying to address, the education of at-risk youth, what are we trying to achieve there? How are we trying to educate them? How do we know when they are educated? Are we talking about higher rates of attending college? Are we talking about higher rates of high school graduation? Are we talking about increases in grade point average? Are we talking about increases in SAT or ACT scores? What types of clear goals do we have that we are trying to achieve? So we clearly defined our goals. We then collect all of the available information that is out there on this issue or on this problem. We use all the available information that is out there to clearly identify strategies or means that will help us achieve those goals. So how do we increase GPA? How specifically can we increase high school graduation rates? And we come up with all these different alternatives, all these different strategies. And we put together a full range of all the possible alternatives and strategies. From that full range of alternatives and strategies, we will then analyze them and select the best alternative. That best alternative will then become the focus of our public policy. So it's the search for the one best approach to addressing this issue or solving this problem. Now, the advantages of rational comprehensive decision-making are clear. You're taking into account all information. You're putting together a full, complete range of different alternative solutions, which means that you can then say that, yes, indeed, we have selected the best alternative solution. So it's a very holistic, very comprehensive way of making policy decisions. The criticisms of rational comprehensive is that there are a lot of externalities. There are a lot of unintended consequences that we are not able to foresee as we put together all these different alternatives. Essentially, we may be trying to solve this problem, and so we select this strategy as the best strategy. But in selecting this strategy as the best strategy, there are going to be some unintended consequences of pursuing that strategy. Some things are going to occur that we didn't really prepare for or that we didn't really foresee. And rational comprehensive, it's difficult in this decision-making model to accommodate and take into account all those unintended consequences. It's also difficult to be purely rational and comprehensive because we as policy makers and policy implementers, we are human beings. And as human beings, we have some inherent limitations to our cognitive abilities. There is only so much information that we can access and only so much information that we can understand. Our goals are not always as clearly defined as they would be under rational comprehensive. So we may have a general sense of what we are trying to achieve, but our specific goals may be in conflict with each other, or we may not be able to get everyone to agree on what the specific goals are. So we all agree we should work toward educating at-risk youth. But maybe some people will say the goal is so they'll have a better GPA. Others would say, no, that's too intermediate of a goal. The real goal is whether or not they can get into college. Someone else will say, well, no, the real goal is whether or not they can get into a reputable college. And then you can have that disagreement about what goals really are and how those goals are actually defined. But in incrementalism, you're not able to easily define your goals. You're also, as a human being with cognitive limitations, not able to put together all the information that is out there. We as human beings have cognitive limitations. We have what Herbert Simon refers to as bounded rationality. There are boundaries and limitations to just how rational we can be. We can't go out there and get all the information because we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, and we don't have the cognitive ability to get all the information out there. So we collect the information that we have the ability to collect, which is limited information. Limited information is going to lead to a creation of a limited range of strategies and alternative solutions. We're not going to have the full range of every possible alternative. We're going to have a limited range of alternatives that we can consider. If we have a limited range of alternatives, it could very well be the case that the best alternative we have not even thought of. The best alternative is still out there, but we haven't been able to conceptualize it. We haven't been able to consider it. So we can never in incrementalism say we are selecting the best solution to this policy problem. Instead, what we do is we select the first solution that is appropriate and works for us now. So we find a solution in this limited range of alternatives, and it works for us now. It looks like it's going to help solve the problem. That then becomes the subject of our public policy. So it's a limited range of alternatives, and we're going to do what's called limited successive comparisons, where we are going to compare one alternative to another. So we'll compare alternative A to alternative B, and then B to C, and then C to D, and then A to D, and then B to D, and so on and so on. We make these very limited successive comparisons to come up with the first appropriate alternative that works for us now as the basis for our policy. So it's no longer the search for the best solution or the best answer. It's a search for the most appropriate answer that works for us now with our given time limitations and resource constraints. Charles Lindblom, it's a very famous public administration theorist who first postulated this idea of incrementalism. And he wrote an article where he talked about how decisions are actually made in the public sector. And he says decisions are usually not predicated upon rational decision making. They're usually predicated upon this idea of incrementalism. Because we have cognitive limitations, we don't have the time to be purely rational. He referred to rationality as the root approach and incrementalism as the branch approach. We can never really get to the root of the problem. So instead, we deal with the branches of the tree because that's what we have access to. Now, Lindblom received a whole lot of acclaim for his article talking about the root and the branch method, won a lot of awards for it, and he was shocked by it because he said, I'm not really developing any novel theory here. All I'm doing is I am just describing what goes on in the public sector. This is really how we tend to make decisions in the public sector. Incrementalism as opposed to being purely rational and comprehensive. Now, obviously, one of the good things about incrementalism is it saves you time and resources. It's much more practical than rationality. But the disadvantage of incrementalism is that you're never going back and rethinking the policy problem and coming up with a brand new novel policy solution. You're basically just tweaking the policy solutions that have been in place for many, many years. So those solutions are not fully effective, then you're making small mistakes year after year after year. All those small mistakes that are made every single year can really add up to a very big cumulative mistake. And incrementalism doesn't really permit us to go back and really think rationally about a new and novel and different solution to our policy problem. But it is a realistic way of the way in which a lot of decisions are made in policy as well as more generally in the public sector. So when you look at rationality and you look at incrementalism, you are talking about decision-making opposite extremes. So you're talking about on one end, you've got rationality where we are very rational and we take into account all information. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we're being very incremental in nature and only making small marginal changes from one year to the next. Well, there is a third decision-making model that's kind of in the gray area between those two extremes, and that's what's called mixed scanning. And Amitai Etzioni is the author who's usually associated with mixed scanning. Mixed scanning tries to combine the best of both worlds. It tries to combine some incrementalism with some rational comprehension. And the way mixed scanning works is that in some points in time, we will be rational comprehensive. So if it's a very big issue, it's a momentous issue, we will try and be as rational as we can possibly be in developing that policy. However, if it's a much more mundane, day-to-day operational issue, we don't have to be purely rational. We can get away with being more incremental. So, think about like in the world of budgeting, if you are going to build a new city hall that's going to cost you $70 million, that's a big decision that you're going to have to live with that building for generations to come. So you want to be as rational as you can possibly be. That's why local governments usually make those decisions in a separate budgeting process called the capital budgeting process. However, if you're doing something much more mundane, like how many staples is to order for the next year for your office, that's something you can be more incremental with. You can look at how many staples you ordered last year and then make a very small marginal change for the upcoming fiscal year. So big issues, you're rational. Small issues, you're more incremental, which makes a lot of sense to us. You don't want to put all your resources into making a decision if it's a very small, mundane type of decision. The main criticism with mixed scanning is there's a lot of subjectivity that is involved. What is a big issue and what is a small issue may differ depending upon someone's interpretation and someone's perspective. So what is a big issue for you may be a small issue for me, or vice versa. So there's a lot of subjectivity in defining what's a big versus what is a small issue. But mixed scanning is a way where you can kind of combine the best of both worlds, rationality and incrementalism. Then the fourth decision-making model that I think we see a lot in policy formulation is one of my favorite decision-making models, the garbage can model of decision-making. And it comes to us from three authors, Cohen, March, and Olson. Garbage can model of decision-making says that policy decisions tend to be made at the confluence of four different streams of thought. And the four different streams are the participant stream, the problem stream, the solution stream, and what they call the choice opportunity stream. And this is very similar to John Kingdon's approach to agenda setting. So decisions are made in policy. We make big decisions and big changes in policy at the confluence of where these four streams flow together. So the participant stream. In the participant stream, you need to have the quote unquote right people in decision-making positions. You need to have people in decision-making positions who are predisposed to making a change to the way in which we are addressing this policy problem. They need to be predisposed to coming up with a new or different way of addressing this policy problem. So you've got the right participants in place who are ready to make those big changes. Then you have a problem stream. And this is kind of like that primordial soup that John Kingdon told us about. You've got all these problems that are out there in society that are floating around that we're aware of, but we haven't really done a whole lot about. We know that they're out there, they're things that we are aware of, but your participants are interested enough in one of these problems to actually start addressing that problem. So your participants start to flow together with your problem stream and start identifying problems that could be solved with a public policy. So those streams start to flow together. Then your third stream starts to flow in, which is your solution stream. So we've got all these solutions out there that could be used to address this policy problem. Some of these solutions are things that have been around maybe for decades. They were generated as solutions many years ago to address a different problem, but they could address the problem that we're dealing with today. So one of the nice things about the garbage can model decision making is it tends to be non-linear. Rational, comprehensive, and incrementalism are linear decision-making models. You identify your goals, you then identify ways of achieving your goals, and you then select whichever alternative you want to fund in your policy. So it's a very linear process where problems predate the solutions to those problems. So we're developing solutions to then address a problem. Garbage can model decision-making is non-linear. I like to call it the Quentin Tarantino way of making decisions. If you watch a lot of Quentin Tarantino movies, you know that they tend to be relatively non-sequential. And so they don't follow a chronological time frame. Well, garbage can model decision-making is a lot like that. Solutions may predate problems. And so there could be some solutions that we developed back in the 1950s and the 1960s to address a different problem back then, but that solution may be equally useful today for this modern day problem. So there are people in place who are ready to make decisions. We've identified a problem that everyone wants to try and address, and there is a solution, oftentimes a pre-existing solution, that could help solve that problem. So those three streams have flowed together. But we still need that fourth stream for things to happen, and that's the choice opportunity stream. Essentially, this is a triggering event. So something happens that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that this is a policy problem that is worthy of addressing. It's worthy of formulating a policy to solve it. It's worthy of spending public taxpayer money to fund solutions to that problem. So a triggering event could be, some type of disaster, or could be some type of an event that really galvanizes everybody's opinion around we really need to do something to try and solve this policy problem. And when those four streams, participants, problems, solutions, and choice opportunities, all flow together, that's where we tend to formulate new policies. And kind of give you an example to kind of bring this garbage can model of decision making to life. Several years ago, there was an airline disaster, the ValueJet crash. And there was an airline ValueJet. And ValueJet, one of their planes, crashed into the Florida Everglades. Crashed into the Florida Everglades is ValueJet 582. Crashed in the Florida Everglades back in 1996, killing all 110 people on board. The way in which garbage can model decision-making worked in this example is you had your participant stream. You had consumer rights groups, you had members of Congress who were predisposed to doing something about the problem of airline safety. So you had people who are willing to formulate a policy. Your problem was, in terms of airline safety, what had happened on ValueJet 582 is a fire had broken out in the cargo bay of the plane. There were no smoke detectors or any indications that that fire was going on. And by the time that the crew realized that that fire was happening, it was too late. The fire had already burned through the electronics and there was no way to recover the plane. And unfortunately, the plane crashed as a result of that fire. We have solutions. And the solution is not something we created in 1996. It's a solution that predated 1996, smoke detectors. Smoke detectors have been around for decades before that. But here was a solution. We could put smoke detectors, require the smoke detectors be placed in the cargo bay of these planes so that the crew could have advance notice that there was a problem in that cargo bay. So it was a pre-existing solution that we were able to apply to a problem. And obviously this became a lot, there became a lot of momentum toward coming up with a new policy requiring smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes because of the triggering event. And that was the crash of ValueJet 582 in 1996. So it's just an example of how we ended up with this requirement for smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes because of this confluence of these four different streams that came together. And I think that garbage can model decision making explains a lot of our policy formulation and gives us a lot of reasons why some policies are formulated and some policies never get onto the decision making agenda of Congress or a state legislature. So I think that's really the garbage can model decision making that shows us some glimmers of rationality. I think that's kind of what we have in policy formulation, in that oftentimes our policies are really driven by incrementalism, but every now and then, because you have a triggering event and the right people in place to make a major change, you kind of have these glimmers of rationality. And that's when we tend to see major changes to our public policies in this country. But public administrators are very much involved in this policy formulation process because those solutions that we are applying to a problem in policy formulation, oftentimes those solutions are going to be informed by public administrators because the public administrators are the experts in this issue. You know, they're the ones who are implementing these issues and dealing with these issues on a daily basis. So they have the expertise that they can provide to elected officials in terms of informing elected officials, not only about what the nature of the problem is, but what some of the possible solutions are and what some of the consequences of those possible solutions may be. And that's why we see public administrators very much involved in the policy formulation process. So we have a lot of decisions that are being made in terms of what issues rise to the level of becoming public policies, what solutions we're going to fund in order to try and address those problems, how we know when those problems are going to be solved. All those decisions get made in that policy formulation process. Once the policy is formulated, and once that enabling legislation has been passed either by Congress or by the state legislature or even by a city council, that policy then needs to be implemented. And then you move into the second phase of the policy process, which is policy implementation. Now, we would normally think in the old civics approach, high school civics approach to public policy, that once policy has been formulated, all the decisions have been made. And so now it's just up to the administrators to go out there and implement the policy in accordance with the requirements that were put into the policy during policy formulation. We know as administrators that's not accurate. We know there are a lot of decisions that still need to be made in terms of policy implementation. Oftentimes, these policies, once they are passed by a legislative body, are relatively vague and ambiguous. The legislative bodies leave out a lot of the details that would govern the implementation of those policies. And those details are then left to administrators in the implementation process. That's where we get the administrative rulemaking process. So in implementation, we have to write the rules that will govern the implementation of these policies. And in writing those rules, it provides administrators with a lot of decision-making authority. So we have to write a rule that will govern how we're going to distribute these grant funds to recipients. So in the administrative rulemaking process, if we're going to write a rule to govern implementation, we have to give public notice that this rule is being written. We then have to allow public comment and have public hearings to get input from the public in terms of how they would like to see the rule written. We have to take that public comment into account. And then we have to, when we decide what the rule will be, we then have to publish that rule in advance of that rule actually having legal standing, so that again, people can review that rule and they can respond to that rule and they can criticize that rule. So there's a lot of scrutiny and oversight in how administrators write these administrative rules to govern the implementation of policies. But the mere fact that they can write these rules and make these decisions about how policies need to be implemented is a great deal of power that public administrators have over the eventual success or failure of those public policies. the best designed policy in policy formulation can fail because of improper implementation during the implementation process. We know that there are a lot of barriers in the implementation process that will make it difficult for us to effectively implement our policies and achieve the stated goals of those policies. It's a very famous work by Pressman and Wildowski. And way back several decades ago, they looked at a case study of the implementation of a federal program in Oakland, California. And so what they wanted to do is see how this program, of this policy, I should say, was being implemented in Oakland, California. And they wanted to see why these policy goals were not being achieved through implementation. What they found is there were dozens of barriers to effective implementation. Some of the barriers that they found, number one, is that there were multiple competing policy goals. That it wasn't just that the policy had one goal, the policy had multiple goals. And those multiple goals sometimes competed against each other, much like the values in public administration compete against each other. We had mentioned earlier that in public administration, one of our values is obviously efficiency. But when you're going to be efficient, sometimes that means you can't be as open and transparent as you would like to be. The more open and transparent you are, oftentimes the less efficient you are. And so you can have these conflicts between your goals. And that's what they found, multiple goals that conflicted with each other. They also found that there were a lot of decisions that were being made in terms of how that policy was being implemented. And those decisions are being made by the implementers at the local level in Oakland, California. What they found is the more decisions that were left to the implementers, the less successful the overall implementation of that policy would be. They also looked at the implementers and what they felt about the policy and how strongly they felt about that policy. So the direction and intensity of the implementers. And I'll show you on the next slide in a second what they found, but basically it made a difference whether or not these implementers supported the policy and how strongly they support the policy, as opposed to not supporting the policy and how strongly they oppose that policy. How strongly they oppose or support a policy can lead to a lot of bargaining in the implementation process. That implementers started bargaining with each other, started bargaining with recipients, started bargaining with stakeholders over how this implementation would take place. The more opportunities for bargaining, the less successful implementation tended to be. And then they also found that sometimes to implement a policy, you end up seeing the federal government create a lot of different new agencies. And then you create new agencies that then come into conflict with existing agencies, again, causes a lot of confusion, makes it difficult to implement those policies. But I think their most enduring conclusion had to do with how participants, how implementers feel about the policy. Whether they supported the policy or whether they opposed the policy, and how intensely they supported or opposed the policy. So Pressman and Wildowski tell us that you've got basically 4 different alternatives here. One alternative is that you have implementers who are very positive about the policy. They're very supportive of the policy and at a very high intensity level. They're really behind this policy. They really believe in the policy. The more positive and the higher the intensity of that positivity, the less delay you have, and you have no bargaining that has to go on. There's no negotiation, there's no bargaining. It's a very efficient implementation of that policy because everybody's on the same page and everybody agrees. That's your best case scenario for effective implementation. Your worst case scenario is in the cell below that, when you have implementers who have a very negative view of the policy and it's a very high intensity negative view. That's where you have maximum delay. That's where you have a lot of bargaining over the very essentials of the policy itself. This is where the policy will not be properly implemented. This is what they found in Oakland, California. There was so much negativity among the implementers that they just refused to implement that policy. They had a lot of delay. They would bargain over every single aspect of that policy to slow down its implementation. That's your worst case scenario for the policy implementation stage. Then your other two alternatives, you have implementers who are positive about the policy, but not that strongly. So they like the policy, but they're not going to go to battle for the policy. You end up with some minor delays, not a lot of bargaining, but it's not as quick and efficient of an implementation as if they felt strongly about that policy. Then your final alternative is they don't like the policy, they have a negative impression of the policy, but again, they're not going to fight the policy that hard. They don't like it, but it's not that big of a deal to them. You'll have moderate delays. You'll have some bargaining over the peripherals, meaning that you'll have bargaining over, some of the unimportant parts of the policy, but you're not really having bargaining over the very heart of the policy itself. You only really have those major delays and bargaining over the essentials of the policy when your implementers are very much opposed to the policy goals. What this tells us, what Pressman and Waldowski tell us, is that it's very important for us to have the buy-in of our administrators who are implementing these policies. That if administrators do not buy in to this policy and do not support this policy or not strongly in favor of this policy, then even the best designed policy is going to fail in implementation. You really need to involve administrators in formulation so that you can get their buy-in, so that they will then implement this policy in an efficient and an effective manner. So implementation really is very much about getting the involvement of the implementers so that you can get their buy-in to support efficient and effective implementation. After we have implemented a policy, then we need to evaluate that policy. And the third phase of the policy process is policy evaluation. We have to go back and look at our policy, how we implement that policy, and how effective that policy was. We then can feed that information back into the policy formulation process so that we can inform changes that need to be made to that policy, and then also feed our evaluation results back into the implementation phase to then inform new and different ways of implementing the policy as well. So that feedback loop is critical in policy analysis. One of our problems in evaluation is we tend to evaluate public programs too soon. We evaluate public policies before they are ready to be evaluated. Usually, before you can evaluate a public policy, that public policy must be in place for a while so that it can actually generate some outcomes. It can actually generate some results, so you have something to measure in terms of policy effectiveness. You can't evaluate a policy after it's been implemented for a couple of weeks or for a month. You have to give it time for it to actually create the outcomes that you want it to create. So we'll oftentimes do what are called evaluability assessments, where we will assess our policies to see if they are ready to be evaluated. I know it sounds kind of like the Office of Redundancy, but we essentially evaluate our policies to see if they're ready to be evaluated. Do they have measurable outcomes? Are there performance indicators that we can use to determine whether or not or how well this policy is achieving its stated policy goals and objectives? In this evaluation process, this is where we do a lot of our audits, and we audit a lot of our policies to make sure that those policies are achieving their goals and objectives. There are two main types of audits, and we'll talk about these next week when we talk about managing fiscal resources as well. There are financial or legal audits, and there are management or performance audits. In a financial or legal audit, we look at how we spent the money in trying to achieve these policy goals. So it's very implementation type of a focus. How do we spend the money? Did we spend the money in the legally appropriated ways in order to achieve these policy goals? So did we spend the money as administrators in implementation in the way in which we were told we had to spend that money? In a performance or management type of audit, we don't just look at how we spent the money, but we look at how well we spent the money. So this is where we really get into effectiveness. This is where we really analyze those policies to see, did spending X amount of money in this policy area help us achieve our policy goals? So those are the types of audits that we tend to do, the written documentation of our evaluation of our public policies. When you get into your PPA 670 class, policy issue analysis, you will talk about all three of these phases of the policy process again with a lot more nuance and a lot more detail. But here in 500, we look at policy analysis as one of the functions, one of the jobs that we do in the world of public administration. Clearly, we're putting precious public taxpayer resources into funding these policies. So we expect that these policies will be at least partially achieving their policy goals. If not, then we would want to reorient and spend those precious public taxpayer dollars elsewhere on some other policies to actually achieve the goals that we want to achieve. So that's the analysis of public policy, one of the functions of public administration. We said policy is this overarching umbrella, but to actually achieve those policy goals, we are going to funnel our resources into specific public programs that are meant to then support those overarching policy goals. So in addition to engaging in the policy process, we as administrators spend some of our time engaging in program evaluation, where we will look at the programs that we are implementing and determine whether or not these specific public programs are helping us achieve our policy goals. So does funding and implementing this job training program really help us educate at-risk youth, however we are defining the education of at-risk youth? So our second main function is program evaluation. Before we move into program evaluation, this is a really nice breaking point, I think, between the topics. So let's go ahead and take our nightly break. Let's take a break until, let's say 5:15 if we can, because we do have some information to cover in the second half of class. So let's take a break until 5:15. We'll come back, we'll talk program evaluation, and then we'll ask the bigger question of effectiveness. And how do we really measure if we are being effective as an organization? How do we really measure the effectiveness of these policies and these programs? So take a break, come back at 5:15, and we'll talk about public program evaluation. Okay, we are back. Thanks for indulging a shorter break than usual, but I do want to make sure we get through all this information so you have the ability to answer those questions on the final assessment if you want to get started working on the final assessment a little bit early, because it is due in 2 weeks, and those 2 weeks will roll around very, very quickly. So in the second half of class tonight, we're going to turn our attention to some of the things that you're going to encounter when you get to PPA 696, your research methods course. And I know it is kind of strange that we call it research methods when really it's program evaluation. So I can give you a little bit of context on that. It was a few years ago that the faculty who teach PPA 696, we got together and talked about how our previous approach to 696 wasn't working. The way we used to teach 696 is we taught it as classic social science research methods. So it was taught in a very similar way as to how you would have taught it in a sociology or a political science, psychology type of program. Classic social science research methods that applied in all those different disciplines. But again, because public administration is different, we realized that we really needed to focus more on when we would use research skills in the public sector. And in the previous manifestation of PPA 696, we taught the second half of the semester was all talking about statistics and took you through all the different statistical methodologies that can be used in social science research. We realized that that wasn't a very efficient use of our time, and instead we should focus more on program evaluation. How do we take classic social science research methods and put them within the service of evaluating public programs from an empirical basis? That is why now in the program, before you can get a permit to enroll in 696, because 696 is by permit only, you must first show that you have completed an undergraduate statistics course, because we no longer teach statistics in PPA 696. It's all program evaluation. We'll talk about statistical applications, but we don't actually teach those statistical methods. We assume that you have had that instruction at the undergraduate level in an undergraduate statistics course, or if you don't have an undergraduate statistics course, you can meet the prerequisite for 696 by taking PPA 517, Analytical Skills Development, which will then focus on those statistical tools and packages that are applicable in the public service. So when we talk about PPA 696 research methods, we're really talking about program evaluation, because that's where we apply these research methods in the public sector. So our second major function as public administrators is obviously dealing with these public programs. Again, the specific types of programs that will contribute to and support our overarching overall policy goals. So in program evaluation, our purpose is to apply empirical methods to determine the effectiveness of public programs. When we say empirical methods, we use the word empirical. Empiricism refers to obtaining information that is tangible, attaining information that can be collected and can be analyzed and can be interpreted. That's what we mean by empirical. Empirical evidence can be both qualitative as well as quantitative. It doesn't have to involve numbers to be empirical. Qualitative data will be information where we are describing it using words and phrases. Quantitative data, we're describing that information using numbers. And whether we're using words and phrases or using numbers, qualitative or quantitative, it all qualifies as empirical information, because it's information we can sense, we can collect, we can analyze, we can interpret. So we're going to use these empirical methods in order to evaluate the impact of our public programs. Are our public programs achieving goals and objectives, as well as the implementation of these public programs? How efficiently and how well are we implementing these programs? So we're going to do both program impact evaluations as well as program implementation types of evaluations. So let's talk about how we do program evaluation as public administrators and the steps that we go through in evaluating our public programs from an empirically sound basis. We're going to apply our classic social science research methods, but put those methods within the service of evaluating our public programs. And so just like when you do a classic social science research project, your first goal is to establish your research question, and establishing a quote unquote good research question. In program evaluation, we refer to them obviously as evaluation questions. So the evaluation question will tell us what our purpose is in evaluating this program. Good evaluation questions share the same characteristics as good research questions in the social sciences. They are clear. Everyone knows what we mean by the terms we use in our evaluation question. They are answerable, so they can be answered with the analysis of empirical information, and they have more than one possible answer. It's important to have more than one possible answer, because if there's only one possible answer to the question, we probably already know what that answer is. So they need to be clear, answerable, and have more than one possible answer. Here are some examples of evaluation questions that are kind of ripped from the headlines, and that they come from some previous manifestations of research methods course case studies that were used in the PPA 697 directed research course. So one of the case studies that we used to use in 697 for research methods looked at the implementation of a program called the Inmate Reading Intervention Program, whereby inmates, incarcerated individuals, would have the opportunity to participate in the Inmate Reading Intervention Program, whereby a certain number of hours per week, they would do readings, and they'd work with a reading tutor to do these types of reading programs. And the idea is that participation in this Inmate Reading Intervention Program was meant to achieve the program goal of reducing rates of recidivism, reducing rates of reoffending. So a very simple evaluation question could be, does the Inmate Reading Intervention Program, otherwise known as IRIP, decrease rates of recidivism? Another way of looking at it is you can ask, does participation in the Inmate Reading Intervention Program decrease rates of recidivism? If you want to make it a little bit more global in nature, rather than asking a yes/no type of question, you could ask an how type of question. how does the inmate reading intervention program affect rates of recidivism? Or how does participation in the inmate reading intervention program affect recidivism rates? So those are just some different examples of the types of evaluation questions that we tend to ask. When we ask these evaluation questions, just like in social science research, we are looking at relationships between variables. And as you remember from your undergraduate research courses, you know that we're typically looking at relationships between independent and dependent variables. The independent variable, a change in the independent variable is causing a change in the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is the variable that's being changed. The independent variable is the variable that's causing the change. Here in program evaluation, our dependent variable, the variable that is being changed, is usually some measure of the outcome or the result of the program, such as recidivism rates. Our main independent variable is going to be the variable that's affecting the dependent variable, which for program evaluation is going to be some measure of that public program. So perhaps participation in that public program. So maybe we are going to measure participation in the inmate reading intervention program as the number of hours on average per week that an inmate participates in the program. That will be a measure of their participation in the program that will serve as our main independent variable. That's one way to approach it. Another way to approach it is more in what we call a longitudinal nature, where we'll look over a time period and we'll say, okay, let's collect recidivism rates before the inmate reading intervention program was implemented, and then look at recidivism rates after it was implemented to see if recidivism rates have gone down after the implementation of that inmate reading intervention program. If we're doing it in that type of a longitudinal way, then our primary independent variable will essentially be the existence of the inmate reading intervention program. And the way in which we usually do that is we do that as a binary variable. All those years in which the program was not in existence, we'll code all those years as a 0. And every year that the program was in existence, we'll then code all those years as a 1. That's what we call a binary dichotomous way of measuring our independent variable, the measure of our program. Now, again, our goal here, just like in classic social science research methods, is to isolate the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. To isolate the relationship between participation in the program and rates of recidivism. As you know, in order to do that, we are going to have to create control variables and hold those control variables constant in order to truly isolate the relationship between program participation and our dependent variable, rates of recidivism. So we'll need to create control variables for all those other variables that could independently affect recidivism rates. So one control variable we may want to look at is we may want to look at the type of crime that was committed. Excuse me, the type of crime that was committed. There are higher recidivism rates we know in the field of criminal justice for certain type of crimes as opposed to other types of crimes. So what type of crime was committed? That could be a control variable. Another control variable could be whether or not drugs were involved in the commission of that crime. We know that when there are drug-involved crimes, the recidivism rates tend to be much higher than in crimes that did not involve any type of drug abuse. And so we look at, are there drugs involved as one of our control variables. So we also know that recidivism rates also tend to change depending upon age, and that older inmates tend to reoffend at a lower rate than younger inmates. And so those are all the types of control variables that we'll want to create, again, so we can isolate the true relationship between participation in the IRIP program and rates of recidivism. So it's developing our measurable indicators and our measurable variables. Then our third step is, again, just like we'll do in a classic social science research project. We then must come up with a research design. We have to design our research. In program evaluation, there are basically two main categories of research designs that we tend to use: experimental designs and quasi-experimental designs. Now, in classic social science research, you probably also use pre-experimental or non-experimental designs. We don't use those very often in program evaluation because they don't allow us to truly see the relationship between our program and its desired outcome. So we typically tend to use either experimental or quasi-experimental designs. Now, if you remember back to your undergraduate research course, you know the main difference between experimental and quasi-experimental designs is that in an experimental design, we are randomly assigning our subjects to either an experimental group or a control group. Those who are randomly assigned to the experimental group are exposed to the independent variable. Those who are randomly assigned to the control group are not exposed to the independent variable. So like in medical research, those in the experimental group will receive the medication that's being tested. Those in the control group will receive a placebo. So they're not exposed to that medication. So we create experimental and control groups through random assignment. Random means that there is an equal non-zero chance of being picked. So everyone has an equal non-zero chance of being picked for either the experimental or the control group. So in social science research, we refer to them as experimental and control groups. In evaluation, we refer to them as project groups or comparison groups. So the experimental group we refer to as a project group in program evaluation. The control group we oftentimes refer to as a comparison group. So just different type of nomenclature that we use for program evaluation as compared to classic social science research methods. Now, as you probably learned at the undergraduate level in your research course, there are lots of different types of experimental designs. There's a classic experimental design, Solomon 4 group designs, post-test only comparison group designs, pre-test, post-test single group designs. There are a lot of different manifestations of experimental designs. We're not going to really get into those tonight in this class because we rarely are able to use experimental designs in program evaluation. Because to use any type of experimental design, you must be able to randomly assign your subjects to either the experimental, the project group, or to the control group, the comparison group. The problem for us in program evaluation is a lot of the programs that we are evaluating are what we consider to be entitlement programs, in that they are eligibility-based programs. So people who meet the eligibility requirements to get the benefits from this program are legally entitled to those benefits. So if we were to randomly assign someone who is legally entitled to participate in the program and we assign them to the comparison group and we deny them those benefits, that's going to run counter to statute. That's going to be illegal, also ethically questionable because those people should be getting the benefits that they are legally entitled to. So we oftentimes can't do random assignment in program evaluation. That's why instead of experimental designs, we tend to use what we call quasi-experimental designs. Now, the whole benefit of an experimental design is that when you randomly assign someone to an experimental group, a project group, and randomly assign other people to a control, a comparison group, you are creating equivalency between those groups. Because if you've truly done a good job of randomly assigning people to your different groups, those people in your different groups will be equivalent to each other on every single factor, every single variable, except exposure to the independent variable. The only thing that separates your experimental group participants from your control group is the experimental group is exposed to the independent variable. Which means that if that's the only difference between your groups, then any differences in your dependent variable will be directly attributable to participation or non-participation in that independent variable. That's the benefit of an experimental design. So when we're not able to use an experimental design, we lose the equivalency between our experimental and our control groups. So we need to do something to make up for that. We need to do something in order to try and make those groups as equivalent as possible, because the more equivalent those groups are, the better we can isolate the true impact of participation in the program, participation in the independent variable. So in quasi-experimental designs, the way we make our groups equivalent to each other is through the use of statistics. This is where control variables become very, very important. So if we think that, say, for instance, socioeconomic status, the combination of income and education, could have an impact upon our dependent variable. What we'll need to do is create a control variable for socioeconomic status. We'll then measure all of our subjects on socioeconomic status, give them a score on socioeconomic status, so that we can parcel socioeconomic status out, and we can then isolate the true relationship between participation in the program and the dependent variable. So we use the creation of control variables and using statistics in order to make our two groups equivalent in nature. So the big difference is with the experimental design, we make our groups equivalent through design. We do it through random assignment. In quasi-experimental designs, we don't have access to random assignment, so therefore we have to control for equivalency through the use of statistics and the creation of those control variables. So usually we're doing quasi-experimental designs. That's where we end up having all these additional control variables. That's when we kind of get into multiple regression analysis and those kind of higher order, more sophisticated analytical tools. We also, when we do quasi-experimental designs and program evaluation, we're usually also interested in doing a longitudinal analysis, in that we just don't want to take a snapshot in time. We just don't want to see how these subjects are scoring on the variables today. We want to know how those scores have changed over time, because someone may benefit more the longer they are participating in a program. It may take several months or several years for participation in the program to then have its desired effect. Now think about if you were counseling veterans and you're counseling veterans for things like PTSD. That's going to take a long time. It's going to be a gradual process for those veterans to find any success and to find any benefits from that counseling and from those therapy sessions. So you're going to want to look at your variables over that longitudinal period of time. So it's very common in program evaluation for us to use what we call longitudinal time series analysis. We'll collect information on our subjects, on all of our variables over a period of time so that we can establish trend lines in our data to see if the program is being more beneficial over time, becoming less beneficial over time. We will have those types of trend lines in a longitudinal time series analysis. And there are a variety of different tools that we can use when we're doing a time series. We won't get into them in this class, but there's something called ARIMA modeling. It stands for Autoregressive Integrated Moving Averages. Don't worry about it for this class, but that's one of the primary methods that tends to be used for analyzing the data we get from these longitudinal time series analyses. But typically, we're going to have to do something quasi-experimental, usually a longitudinal time series analysis, when we are dealing with the evaluation of public programs, programs that people have legal eligibility to, so we cannot deny them benefits to the programs that they are legally eligible for. Then our fourth step in program evaluation is similar to our fourth step in social science research, and that's the construction of our sample. We have to decide where we are collecting our data from and from what subjects we will collect our data. As you probably remember from your research course, the type of sampling design can be broken up into two broad categories. There are probability-based sampling designs and non-probability-based sampling designs. Probability-based sampling designs have a parametric type of element to them, in that in a probability type of sampling design, we are going to select subjects randomly. So every person in our population, in theory, has an equal non-zero chance of being selected to be part of the sample that we're going to use for our program evaluation. We use samples because we don't have the resources to collect information from our entire population of program participants. If it's a federal program, we may literally have tens of millions of people who are participating in that federal program. We don't have the time, the resources, or the wherewithal, or the cognitive ability, as Herbert Simon tells us, to collect information from every single participant. So instead, we'll collect and we'll construct our representative sample, a sample that represents the population as a whole. To get the most representative sample possible, we will want to randomly select people from the population to serve as part of our evaluation sample. That's called probability sampling. In probability sampling, there are different ways in which you can randomly select members of the participation to participate in the sample for the program evaluation. The most representative sample that you can create is usually created through a simple random sampling process. Simple random sampling is where we will number all the cases in our population, or number as many of the cases in our population as we can. Then using a random number generator, we will then randomly select numbers from our population and include those into our sample. It's a purely random way of creating our sample. The more representative our sample is of our population, the more representative the results we get from our sample will be of the results we would have gotten from our population if we could have collected data from our entire population. So simple random sampling, when you can do it, will give you the most representative sample and the most accurate results for your program evaluation. Sometimes we can't do simple random sampling. So for instance, if we don't have a list of everyone in our population, we're not going to be able to do simple random sampling. So some other variations in terms of other probability types of samples, there's something called stratified random sampling. So in stratified random sampling, what we will do is we'll divide our sample up on an important characteristic. So let's say we have a program in a senior citizen center. And the program in that senior citizen center is a mobility program that is meant to make our senior residents more mobile and to reduce the number of falls that they've experienced. So we want to see who benefits the most and what characteristics people have that benefit the most from this mobility program. We may want to divide our sample up according to people who have fallen in the last 6 months versus people who have not fallen in the last 6 months. So we're using the variable of whether or not they've fallen in the last 6 months to stratify our sample, to divide our sample up, because whether or not they've fallen is the primary thing that we're looking at as a measure of effectiveness for this mobility program. So that's when we stratify our sample according to a very important variable that we want to look at. Systematic sampling is another probability sampling design. Say, for instance, we want to do a program evaluation of the programs that are being provided by a local health clinic. So we have a local health clinic that is providing programs, health programs, on an anonymous basis. So people don't have to give their name or identity. They go in, they get a benefit from these health programs on an anonymous basis. We clearly don't have a list of people in that population, what's called our sampling frame. We don't have a sampling frame. We don't have a list of people in our population. So to do a program evaluation in that type of situation, the evaluator may position themselves outside of the local health clinic. And then they will interview maybe every 10th person or every 20th person who walks out of that local health clinic. That's called systematic sampling. The system is every 10th or every 20th person that uses those services, those programs in the health clinic. Which person you pick, the 10th or the 20th or the 30th, in systematic sampling, that's called your skip interval. So the logic is that if you had a skip interval of 10, you would interview every 10th person. If you had a skip interval of 20, you would interview every 20th person, and so on and so on. It'll give you somewhat of a random sample, but it will not be a purely random sample because everyone does not have a random, equal, non-zero chance of being selected. If you're using 10 as your skip interval, that means that person number 9 and person number 11 have a 0 chance of being selected because you're only selecting person number 10. So it's not purely random. Another type of probability design that we use a lot in program evaluation is what's called cluster sampling, and specifically multi-stage cluster sampling. The Census Bureau uses this a lot. This is kind of their go-to methodology for evaluations, other than their every 10-year enumeration of the population. The Constitution requires that every 10 years, we have to do an enumeration, an actual count, a head count of the entire population. That has to be an actual count. But for all the other research and all the other evaluations the Census Bureau does in between those 10 years, they usually use multi-stage cluster sampling. Multi-stage cluster sampling is a good thing to use in your evaluation if you don't have a sampling frame, a list of possible subjects, at the level of measurement that you need. So say, for instance, you want to do a program evaluation of some household support program and how it benefits individual households. You may not have a list of every individual household within your jurisdiction. So what you do is you have to create that list. You have to create that sample through a cluster sampling process. So you might start out with a list of all the counties in California, and then you'll randomly select maybe 5 counties out of that list of counties. Then from those 5 randomly selected counties, that's your first cluster. You'll then select perhaps a cluster of 5 cities within each one of those counties. That's your second cluster. Then from each of those cities that you have selected, you'll then select a random sample of neighborhoods. And then from the random sample of neighborhoods, you'll then select a random sample of streets. Then from that random sample of streets, you'll then select a random sample of households, and that will then be the sample you use for your evaluation. Hence why it's called a multi-stage cluster sampling type of an approach. Sometimes we don't have the ability to randomly select because oftentimes people decide whether or not to participate in a program. And so they self-select, and so we don't really have the opportunity to do any probability type of sampling. That's what leaves us then with the second category of non-probability sampling, when we are not selecting people on a random basis. One way we can do it is through convenience sampling. So if I want to know what PPA 500 students think about the MPA curriculum, I could ask everyone who's here tonight, because you're convenient, you're here on Zoom in front of me, I can ask you those questions. It's very convenient to do so, but you may not be representative of the entire student population in the MPA program. So you're convenient, but you may not be representative. Another non-probability approach is what's called snowballing. And this is something we do use in program evaluation, especially if we're trying to reach a hard to contact population. We do this oftentimes when we are dealing with programs that are meant to benefit people who are homeless. And so they don't have addresses. You can't just look them up and then go and interview them. So you do a referral basis. You find one person in that population, you interview them, you ask them to then refer you to someone else in that population who may lack housing. And then you go and interview that person, then ask for a referral, and so on and so on. Hence the reason why it's called snowballing, because your sample will get bigger and bigger the more people you get referrals from. So again, we like to use the probability sample because it's more representative of our population, but sometimes in program evaluation, because of self-selection, we're not able to use probability sampling, and we have to use something more non-probability, which makes it less representative, and we have less confidence in the results we get from that program evaluation. We do have these inherent limitations when we're dealing with the evaluation of public programs. Step 5 is just like in social science research, we collect our data. Typically in program evaluation, we collect a lot of our data through either survey research or secondary data. We use survey research to collect individual level data. Sometimes we'll do interviews or focus groups to also get that individual data. And then we oftentimes use secondary data to get the more aggregate level type of information. Aggregate level meaning a societal type of basis. So survey research, secondary data tend to be the 2 primary data collection vehicles that we tend to use. Again, we do some interviewing, but we do less interviewing in program evaluation than we would typically do if we were in the world of sociology or psychology or one of those other social science disciplines. Once we've collected our data, then we have to analyze that data through the use of statistical methods. The trend in program evaluation has been a trend toward more sophistication in terms of the analysis of our data. And you can go back and look at public administration review, go and look at articles, as I told you last week, from the 1960s or 1970s and compare them to articles from today. Or look at GAO evaluations of programs from the 1970s compared to GAO evaluations from programs today. And you'll see a much more statistically sophisticated approach being used. Rather than just using descriptive statistics where you take a snapshot of the characteristics of our sample, We'll do more associational type of relationship, looking at correlations between the program and its desired outputs. And our gold standard obviously is causal research, asking the questions such as, does participation, or how does participation in this program result in or cause this desired effect? Because again, in this respect for our programs, effectiveness is being defined as, is participation in this program, or is the existence of this program contributing to the desired outcome that we have stipulated in our program or our policy goals. So don't be afraid of statistics. Statistics play a very important role today in public program evaluation. And then we take those statistical analysis results and we use them to arrive at our conclusions. Conclusions regarding the effectiveness of the program, looking both at the impact of the program as well as the implementation of that program. So typically in program evaluation, we're looking both at effectiveness of the program in terms of its impact, as well as the effectiveness and the efficiency of how well we are implementing that program and providing those services to our citizens and to our clients or consumers, however you like to term them. So in program evaluation, we are evaluating the efficacy of our programs to see how well they are contributing to the overarching policy goals that they are meant to support. So some students in the program like to take PPA 670 and PPA 696 kind of back to back, because there is a good deal of overlap in some of the methods that you'll talk about in both 670 and 696. So sometimes you want to kind of have those two courses juxtaposed with each other so you can benefit from them being in close proximity. And you don't have to do that, but in my experience in the program, I've seen a lot of students kind of take them, if not together in the same semester, take them in adjoining semesters. But our entire goal here with policy and program is to try and determine how effective we are at achieving our policy goals and our program goals. And so we need to spend a little bit of time here at the conclusion of class tonight talking about this idea of effectiveness, because over and over tonight we've talked about, is this policy effective at achieving its goals? Is this program effective at achieving its desired outcome? We really need to deal with this issue of effectiveness and what we mean by effectiveness. In the field of public administration, effectiveness can be defined in a variety of different ways. And there are four basic models that we use to assess effectiveness. Effectiveness of policies, effectiveness of programs, effectiveness of organizations. The first approach is what's called the goal attainment approach. The goal attainment approach we use in policy, we use in program evaluation, and we also use it to assess the effectiveness of our organizations as well. In the goal attainment approach, it's the simplest, most direct approach, where we look at the link between our stated goals and effectiveness. So are we achieving our goals? Are we achieving our goals as stated in our policy, in our program, or our goals as we have stated in our strategic plan as an organization? So look for that direct linear link between the program, the policy, or the organization and its stated goals. How well are we achieving those goals? What progress are we making toward the achievement of those goals? The primary shortcoming of the goal attainment approach is that it doesn't consider a lot of complications. It's really concerned with that output-outcome side of the equation, but it doesn't really look at a lot of the things that can go wrong through the process of implementation. It implies the view of management that is very rational in nature, and that the management of our policies and our programs are rational as well as orderly types of processes, and that we have a singular expression of goals that we can identify, and that we can look at how those processes contribute to the achievement of that singular goal. The problem is there are different types of goals. There are what we consider to be official goals, and there are what we consider to be operative goals. An official goal is the stated goal of the organization, the policy, or the program. I mean, this is the long-term goal. So for educating at-risk youth, our long-term goal is to better educate those at-risk youth. I mean, that's the long-term overarching eventual goal of everything that we are doing. However, there are operative goals or intermediate goals that we need to achieve along the way that will help get us to this long-term official goal. And sometimes it's hard for us to distinguish what is an official long-term goal with what is more of an operative intermediate goal. And for some people, it's the operative intermediate goal that's actually more important than the official long-term goal. When you have multiple goals, sometimes those goals will end up competing with each other. And so you may be effective at achieving one goal, but by being effective at achieving that goal, you are ineffective at achieving another goal. It's kind of like a zero-sum game, that in achieving one goal, it means by definition, you're not going to be able to achieve another goal. So there are a lot of those types of complications that the goal attainment approach is a little bit too simplistic to be able to embrace all those types of complications. But when we talk about effectiveness in public administration, again, organizational effectiveness, policy effectiveness, or program effectiveness, we are usually conceptualizing it in this goal attainment type of approach. How well are we achieving our stated goals? And that's the most common way that we measure effectiveness in the public sector. But it's also important to know there are other ways that we can measure effectiveness as well. A second model of effectiveness is the systems resource approach. And if you remember, we talked about the theoretical perspectives in public administration. We identified one school of thought called the systems school. And within that systems school, we talked about open systems theory. Open systems theory that looks at the relationship between the organization and its surrounding environment. And we said in open systems theory, those theorists believe that organizations can survive by pulling in resources and energy from the external environment. That there's this process we identified as negative entropy, whereby organizations are not always dissipating energy into their environment, but they're pulling new energies in from their environment as well through negative entropy. That's this idea of the systems resource approach, that an organization or a program or a policy is effective if it has the ability to bring in and exploit resources from its environment. So you look at the resources an organization generates from its environment, whether it be staffing, whether it be money, whether it be political support. Policies can also generate resources from their environment, again, in terms of more appropriations in future years, in terms of political support from elected officials. You look at all of those resources that are being pulled in as measures of effectiveness. Now, that can be a difficult criterion to measure. And sometimes it's difficult to see all the resources that are being acquired by an organization or by a policy. But this is just another way of viewing the effectiveness of an organization. How well, or effectiveness of a policy, how well are you able to acquire additional resources? Because the better you can acquire additional resources from your environment, the more likely your organization, your policy, or your program will survive into the future. This is where we typically use a longitudinal time series approach, in that we will evaluate our effectiveness over a period of time. We'll look at the resources that we were able to acquire at one point in time, and then look at how those resources have grown over maybe a 5 or 10 or 15 or 20-year period of time. So it's very a longitudinal type of approach in using the systems resource type of model for effectiveness. Looking at a systems resource way of measuring effectiveness is oftentimes useful when other indicators are difficult to obtain or hard to measure. So if our goals are very amorphous, they're very vague, and they're very intangible and difficult to measure, it may be tough for us to use a goal attainment type of model. The systems resource model is an alternative that we can use, because hopefully we can see more tangible types of resources like people and money and political support. So it's just another way of measuring effectiveness. A third model of measuring effectiveness is what's called the participant satisfaction model. And the participant satisfaction model can really cross over into the systems resource model, or it can be more human resources in nature, meaning that if the participants that you are trying to satisfy. And the whole idea behind the participant satisfaction model is we are being effective as an organization or a policy or a program when we are satisfying the wants, needs, and desires of our relevant stakeholders, of our strategic constituencies. So are citizens satisfied with the services that they are receiving from the city? How satisfied are they? That's a participant satisfaction measure of effectiveness. If our citizens are 95% of our citizens are satisfied with the services they're getting, that could be an indicator of effectiveness. If their satisfaction rates have increased by 30% over the past 5 years, that's an indicator of effectiveness. So how well are we satisfying the wants, needs, and desires of our strategic constituencies in our environment? If we're looking in our external environment at participants out in constituencies in our external environment, we're more in the systems resource type of model, in that we're looking at if they're happy, if they're satisfied, they're going to provide us with support, and that's a resource we can get. If we're looking more internal to the organization, we're looking at the satisfaction of our employees, and we're defining our strategic constituencies as our employees within our organization. When we're looking within our organization and trying to satisfy our employees, that's when we're more interested in human resources management. That's when we're trying to help develop our employees as human resources. So again, this participant satisfaction model kind of bridges over between systems resource and human resource approach, depending upon how external or how internal our constituencies are. But basically, our measure of effectiveness is how satisfied are our external or internal constituencies with what we are doing as an organization or as a policy or as a program. So effectiveness is based upon satisfaction. And then your fourth model is the internal process model of effectiveness. With the internal process model of effectiveness, we look internal to the organization at the organization's health, efficiency, and culture. So we look inside the organization at the internal processes that are going on within that organization. So indicators of effectiveness with an internal process type of model are things like a strong organization culture, a positive work climate, kind of this esprit de corps, this feeling that everyone is in it together, this team spirit, group loyalty, teamwork, confidence, trust, communication between workers and management. Decision-making that is done near information sources, meaning that decisions are made by people who have the information necessary to make those decisions. They're not decisions made only at the top of the organization and then handed down. Lower levels of the organization, where the actual job is being done, those individuals are also able to participate in the decision-making process. The sharing of relevant facts and feelings horizontally and vertically within the organization. Proper rewards for performance and growth, development of subordinates, creating effective working groups, interactions in the organization between all the different parts in the organization. When conflict arises, that those conflicts are resolved in the benefit of the organization. Basically, with the internal process approach, we are defining effectiveness as a measure of organizational health. How healthy are we within the organization? So oftentimes we use the internal process approach when we are measuring the effectiveness of our public organizations. Again, it's just another way of defining and measuring effectiveness. When we are looking at effectiveness within an organization, a public organization, again, there are lots of different discrete indicators of that, things like productivity, efficiency. Profit doesn't really apply to most of our government agencies. Quality, number of accidents, growth, absenteeism, employee turnover, job satisfaction, motivation, morale, control, conflict versus cohesion, flexibility and adaptation, how well we plan and set our goals, how much goal consensus we have, agreement between individuals and the organization on the goals that that organization will pursue, how well employees internalize the goals of the organization, role and norm congruence. Do we have agreement about what people's roles are and the norms and expectations of that organizational culture? Interpersonal skills of management, task skills of management, information management and communication, the readiness of the organization, utilization of the organization environment, evaluations by external entities, stability, value of human resources, participation in shared influence. Just again, some examples. I don't want to go through all of them, but just some examples of some discrete indicators of how we know if we have achieved effectiveness, especially within these public organizations that are implementing these public policies and these public programs. So just to compare our 4 different models to each other, this is a template, if you will, that comes to us from some authors named Quinn and Rohrbach. And essentially what they do is they say, we can compare the effectiveness in the public sector based upon the types of models or definitions of effectiveness being used. So you can see there are 4 different models up here in your template. The bottom right of your chart, you have what's called the goal attainment model. They call it rational goal. This is that first model we talked about, the goal attainment model, where we are defining effectiveness as how well we are achieving our goals as an organization, a policy, or a program. Our focus here is very much on productivity. How productive are we at achieving our goals? The goal attainment model is very much focused on control, in that these goals are established within the organization, policy goals are established within enabling legislation, and we really want to control how we're implementing these policies and programs, what we are doing in the organization, so that we can achieve those goals. So it's very much of a control orientation. That's why it's at the bottom of this chart. All the models that emphasize control are on the bottom. The ones that emphasize flexibility are on the top. You'll also notice that the goal attainment, the rational goal model, is on the right side of the chart, which means that it emphasizes an external approach, in that we are looking at achieving goals oftentimes beyond the walls of the organization. The constituencies that we are serving are usually external to the organization. So that's your goal attainment approach, measuring effectiveness through how well we are achieving our goals. In the top right-hand cell, you see the systems resource model. They call it open systems. It's essentially the systems resource model, the second model of effectiveness that we presented tonight. The goal of the systems resource model is acquiring resources from the environment. When organizations and policies and programs can acquire those types of resources, additional appropriations, additional political support, that's the measure of effectiveness. It's on the right side of the chart because it emphasizes an external approach, because you're looking beyond the walls of the organization for your measurements of effectiveness. How well are you acquiring these resources? And it's at the top of the chart because it favors flexibility. In order to be able to bring these resources into your environment, into your organization, into your policy or your program, you must be adaptable. You must be flexible to the needs of the environment. If you are insulated from your environment, if you are not responsive to your environment, clearly your environment's not going to be willing to provide those resources to your organization, your policy, or to your program. So that open systems is really very much the systems resource, that second model that we talked about. The top left, you have this model they call the human relations model. The human relations model is basically that third model, participant satisfaction model, when we are dealing inside the organization. So if you're outside the organization, participant satisfaction falls into the systems resource open systems model. If you're dealing inside the organization, then the constituents you are trying to satisfy are your employees. And so it really becomes very much of a human relations, human resource type of orientation. Your goal is to try and create cohesion and morale in your organization through helping your employees develop as human resources. It means you're going to have to be flexible because the wants, needs, and desires of your employees will differ from one employee to another. So there's no one size fits all approach. You're going to have to know your employees, know what they need in order to help them develop as resources. But it's on the left side because it is very internal to the organization, because your constituents are your employees. Then the bottom left is this internal process model, that fourth model of effectiveness we just talked about. In that model, your goals are trying to create a stable type of environment with stable type of processes within your organization. You do that through the proper management of information, the proper management of communication. That internal process model is very control oriented, and it also is on the left side of the screen because it's very much focused internally to the organization. So what is the upshot of all of this? The upshot of all of this is that there is no one measure of effectiveness in the public sector. How effective an organization, a policy, or a program is will really be dependent upon which model of effectiveness you are using. Now, usually we use that first model, the goal attainment type of model. We use that because it's a very simple type of model. It's a very linear type of model. It's really easy for us to wrap our brains around the idea of we are effective if we are achieving our goals. The disadvantage, though, as we said, is sometimes we have multiple competing goals. Sometimes it's difficult for us to clearly identify and define those goals that we are trying to achieve. When we don't have clearly identifiable goals, then we might have to use one of the other three methods of measuring effectiveness, such as the systems resource model, which is open systems on this screen up on the top right, the participant satisfaction model, or the internal process model. And so it's just different ways in which we measure effectiveness. Our struggle, and some of those slides I took out from tonight to save us some time, kind of took you through over the past 40 years, the development of how we have tried to measure and enhance effectiveness in the federal bureaucracy. I took those out because I don't really think we need a lot of those details for our discussion, but just know over the past several decades, that's been our primary focus in public administration. How can we make our organizations and our policies and our programs more effective? So as we implement and analyze these policies, we're looking at the effectiveness of those policies. As we implement those programs and evaluate them, we're evaluating them for their effectiveness. Last week, we talked about organization theorists. As we view our organizations, we develop these theories to understand our organizations. Hopefully, these theories will help us be more effective as an organization. So our goals of all of our functions that we are engaging in up to this point in time in public administration is to try and promote and achieve effectiveness. But the important caveat is there are different ways of defining and measuring effectiveness. So when you say our organization is effective, or this policy is effective, or this program is effective, you need to know which of those four models of effectiveness you are using to define effectiveness. But that's been our focus in public administration over the past several decades, trying to find ways to become more effective as organizations, policies, and programs. In order to be more effective as organizations, we oftentimes need to do an effective and efficient job of managing the resources that have been given to us to manage as public administrators. And I think it was week 2 of this class. We talked about the differences between public and private management in terms of ethics and accountability. We said one of the primary differences is there are heightened accountability standards in the public sector because we are dealing with public resources. We're dealing with public resources in the course of our business of implementing these policies and implementing these programs. And 2 of the most valuable resources that we need to manage that are public in nature are human resources and fiscal resources. And so when we get together again next week, we're going to turn our attention to how we manage human resources and how we manage fiscal resources and how we do so as effectively and efficiently as possible to, again, achieve those goals of effectiveness and efficiency in the public sector. So next week, we'll get into human resource management, fiscal resource management, talk about the different strategies we use in managing those types of resources. That will then take us through all the information that you will need to complete your final assessment. Then once we get to the end of the session next week, we'll assess where we are and we'll determine what to do with our last week, our last class session. If we cover all the information we need for the final exam next week, then we'll probably reserve that last class session just kind of as a wrap up. If you have any questions about the final assessment or any final questions about the course or the program, we can use that time just kind of answer any of those last minute questions you may have and kind of send you off then in a good way to move on to your future courses in the MPA program. But next week will be management of human resources and fiscal resources. And that's all I have for you tonight. Again, as you look at that final assessment, feel free to email me any questions you may have on that. Again, your beach board number 4 that's due next week is a pretty quick assignment for you. You can just take what you did on the midterm assessment and share that in discussion board with your colleagues. Do always remember to then respond to 2 of your classmates' postings. And so you should be able to do that relatively quickly. So a pretty light week next week. Then in our last week of class, you'll have your final assessment due, and then you'll also have your final beach board essay due as well. Any questions or anything at all before we call it an evening for tonight? We have a few minutes left, so. Okay. We all good? Okay. If so, I hope you have a great remainder of your week. Again, contact me if you have any questions at all. And next week, we'll be back at it again, 4 o'clock on Wednesday, talking about human resource and financial resource management. Thanks, everyone. Take care.